Jubilee is back at it again with another video, one atheist versus 25 Christians. And there were some interesting points in this video that I wanted to raise with each and every one of you, because I do think these are common arguments I've heard from atheists, and I want to pick them apart a little bit, not to be preachy, not to be trying to convert anyone, but to have an open and honest, robust discussion about atheism versus spirituality, monotheism, faith-based discussions as well, because I think that's kind of missing in our discourse today. But if you haven't already, hit that like button and definitely subscribe. So let's get into it. The atheist that Jubilee highlights in this video is Alex O'Connor, and he makes some really interesting claims. The first is about suffering. Okay, so this has been a claim that many atheists have had about suffering, and Alex goes into detail about why he believes suffering makes God's existence unlikely, speaking to human suffering as well as animal suffering, and saying that, well, there's no meaning in that, so why would an all-loving, all-caring God want there to be suffering to the creatures that he's made in his image? Now, this has been, again, a very common argument from many atheists. I would argue in response to that you can't look at individual instances of suffering to then denigrate the idea of God's existence. It's kind of like looking at life or any chapters of your life by only looking at the most terrible instances within those chapters as justification for all of your suffering, or the idea that those bad chapters then make God's existence not possible as a result. Now, I don't want to, again, be preachy or try to convert anyone, but when we think about denigrating the idea of God's existence, only looking at it through the purpose of suffering, then the question I would ask is, why would every religious and spiritual text, or most all religious and spiritual texts with a hero, have the hero go through stages of darkness, of despair, of suffering, to only come out on the other end reaching some form of liberation, right? So every story, every hero's journey has this kind of arc to it that compels all of us and resonates with most all of us as well. And Joseph Campbell did a really deep dive on this, and he has a wonderful audiobook called The Power of Myth, where it talks specifically about, as he studies different religious texts, he notices these hero journeys. The hero starts off on a quest, is surrounded by suffering, goes through chapter upon chapter of pure suffering, but endures that because he or she knows there's a bigger purpose to existence itself. Now, that to me kind of flies in the face of the argument of, well, because they're suffering, God's existence isn't to be found. I think the opposite is true. It's in the suffering that you do find God's existence, because you can't look at suffering as a one-off. You have to look at suffering as a part of your existence, especially if you're trying to achieve something that is really incredible, that is otherworldly, that will change your life, benefit your life for the better. Now, there are many examples we can use in our day-to-day lives. Relationships are not always up. There are entire chapters where things are down. Finances, there are times where we're all losing money in the stock market or investments. Our careers, there are times in our careers where, just everything's just not going right, or we're distracted, or whatever the case is. And so if we look at our careers, our finances, our relationships only through the lens of the moments where there's suffering, that does a grave injustice to all three of those things when we're trying to achieve something that is truly otherworldly: a raise, a promotion, being a better father, a better husband, a better brother, having a set savings amount for retirement. You do have to go through levels of suffering to achieve that end goal. And that can't happen without chapters of suffering. So the idea that suffering by its nature denigrates the idea of God's existence, I would argue, again, it's through that suffering, it's in that suffering that you find God's existence. And the other thing too, you can't look at suffering as just a one-off. You can't look at it as, I hit some bad luck, therefore, why am I investing? Or my wife and I are going through one argument, therefore we should get a divorce. It's not a productive discussion to have. And I don't want to be ageist, but Alex does look like he's a much younger individual. And I would argue for many of us who came out of university, liberal arts degrees, there's a lack of real life experience that may be missing and may be pushing us away from spirituality as well, which I think may be the case here, because what I notice is Alex does take things at face value when it comes specifically to the Bible. And we'll get into that in a minute about his discussion on the resurrection of Christ. So this has been another claim by many atheists that there's not enough evidence to show that Jesus resurrected from the dead. And then appeared to his disciples after the resurrection. You know, his physical body was no longer in the tomb and he had resurrected. And the story goes that he appeared to his disciples, showing holes in his hands and feet, and that, you know, telling them that, you know, he is one now with God. Now, again, taking this at face value is in fact the fallacy that I find many atheists, and I don't want to denigrate atheists as well, but I do think it's a fallacy in the argument that they have, because again, they're looking at biblical story and mixing that with historical fact and saying, well, factually, this simply could not have happened. And it does require faith to believe in it, right? So let me just put that out there. But I would argue again, similarly, it's not about factually whether or not it happened or not. It's instead about the myth story being an inspiration on how we should lead our lives. So leading up to the crucifixion, Jesus had to openly tell Pontius Pilate that, yes, he is the King of Kings, the Son of God, and he's here to liberate people. And that eventually leads him to a death sentence. Now, the purpose, I think, of that whole story is to say, whether or not it's socially acceptable, you have to, sorry, there's a car honking. Whether or not it's socially acceptable, you do have to find your dharma, in the case of Hinduism, which is the purpose of your existence. And you have to find that purpose and fight for it throughout your life. And in Jesus's case, he's the Son of God. He has to tell Pontius Pilate that he is the Son of God. He doesn't want to do this. In fact, Jesus has a very human moment in the agony in the garden where he's praying to God, asking God, why do I have to do this? Because he knows on the other end of telling Pontius Pilate is in fact crucifixion and a death, and a horrible death at that. So I think what Jesus is saying is follow your dharma even when the world around you is telling you otherwise. I think the other piece to this, and there's many pieces we can take from this, the crucifixion itself, the stages of the cross, the carrying of the cross is something that I think all of us have had happen to us in our lives, where we have to carry on a really big responsibility, despite us not necessarily wanting to do it, but we recognize the importance of doing it. And there's value in it. Earlier to the point of finding meaning through suffering, right? So you carry the cross as a symbol of life. We all have our crosses to bear. That's a common slogan that people talk about. And so when we talk about, you know, the carrying of the cross, we talk about sacrificing to a greater good. And again, that's something, again, many atheists may miss, to say, well, where's the cross and where's the hill, etc. It's like, don't get lost in the factuality of the story. Focus on the story as a myth teaching where you can draw parallels to your own existence. So yes, you do have to have faith that this is a good teaching, but you should translate the teaching into applicable steps in your own life. Now, let's talk about the crucifixion itself. Sorry, let's talk about the resurrection itself, because again, I think this is where many atheists say, well, how could a physical body resurrect from a tomb that was sealed? And again, the purpose here, and I think, and we see this in the Bhagavad Gita as well, and we see this in other religious texts, there's this, okay, so this is really challenging for me to explain because it's been a long journey for me spiritually as well. There is something truly otherworldly about recognizing you're not your body and you're not your mind. And this is a common teaching in Hinduism, in Vedanta studies, etc., the idea of the self. So the idea here is that you think that yourself is your physical body, you know, so you work out, you get fit, you get your hair cut, you take care of your body. And then you also think of yourself as your mind, as your thoughts, as your feelings, etc. Both are illusions. You are not your body and you're not your mind. And you might be thinking, then what am I? And what you are is something deeper than both of those, that is beyond explanation, that is otherworldly, that can withstand all the pains of life as well as all the triumphs and make it through this plane of existence through a level of divinity. Now, this again does require faith, but what Jesus is trying to say in the resurrection is that if you believe yourself to be the body, you are in fact leading down a path of suffering, because the body in Jesus's case wouldn't have been able to carry the cross up the hill and be crucified and then resurrect and tell his disciples that the body is our interpretation of what we think we are. We think we are the body, and we're not. Because the whole point of the Romans crucifying Jesus was to say, we're taking your body away from you. We're going to take it away from you in the most inhumane way possible, crucifying you, and I think you probably died from starving. So you take away the physical body, and suddenly you're in this position of, what am I if I'm not the body? And what Jesus is saying is, you're not the body. You're not the mind. You are, in Jesus' case, the Holy Spirit. In Hinduism, which predates Christianity by thousands of years, the same teaching is found, where Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita is overcome with anxiety, stress, and depression because he has to go on a battlefield, and on the other side he sees people he knows, and he can't bring himself to fight, even though it is a worthwhile fight. And Krishna, one of the gods' incarnations, comes to him and says, buddy, you're not the body and you're not the mind. So Arjuna is overcome in his mind by anxiety, stress, and depression. And Krishna comes to him and says, you're none of those things. You're something more. So pick up your sword and go to fight, knowing that your anxiety, stress, depression isn't who you are. You have a right to labor, but not the fruits of your labor. So Jesus, similarly, by going to Pontius Pilate and saying, hey, listen, man, I am the Son of God. I know you've been hearing rumors of that, but I'm here to tell you I am, and I'm willing to take on whatever punishment you have for me. That is, in fact, a deep spiritual teaching. Now, you might be asking, what does all of this mean? The point of all of this is to say that when some atheists look at the Bible and they look at some religious teachings and they treat them as fact-based, they're leaving out the real emphasis of the story. The reason these stories resonate with millions, billions of people for millennia and as long as time has been around is because it connects with us on a deeper level. It connects with us on a hero's journey, which we can all relate to. It connects with us on suffering, because suffering by itself is in fact meaningless if you look at it through the lens of episodic and not true, like, deeper meaning. And then finally, if you look at yourself as the mind or the body, you by your nature are going to run mad, because you cannot be the mind nor the body. You can't. The mind and the body will eventually go away. Your body will eventually die, and so too will your mind. The purpose is that you find your meaning by letting go of both. If Jesus attached himself to his worth through his body, he would have never resurrected, if that makes sense. Because he would have understood that this pain that he was feeling was who he was, and there's no point to resurrecting. But instead, Jesus says, no, I am not the body, and I'm going to show you I'm not the body. And whether you believe in the resurrection or not, whether it factually happened, is besides the point. It's the teaching of the resurrection that's more important. It's the idea that you are not the body, you are the Holy Spirit. And if you connect with that Holy Spirit, you recognize your mind playing tricks on you, your body in pain and suffering cannot define who you are. It can't. What you are is something that is truly divine. It is not your name, it is not your title, it's not your skin color, it's not your hair, it's not your gender, none of those things. They're all things that go away when you die physically. But what remains is you, the divine entity that will be here regardless of whether this world exists or not. If everything around you is born and dies, birth equals death. And I think that's the key part. Birth equals that Jesus was born, so he must die, but doesn't mean that the spirit dies, if that makes sense. So I understand that this is a leap of faith, and I'm not trying to convert or convince anybody of anything. But atheists, when they're criticizing religiosity for suffering or for resurrection stories, they're missing the real point, which to me is suffering has meaning that is found in the suffering. Resurrection stories have meaning that is found if you get underneath the layer of the story to the essence of what it's trying to tell you, regardless of if it's true or not. This is why people go to movies. This is why fiction books capture us. There's a story there that's not meant to be taken at face value, but meant to resonate deeply with our inner psyche for reasons that we ourselves can't explain. And I think that was one of the conclusions that Joseph Campbell had, was for reasons he can't even explain, there is a myth story that resonates. Anyways, these are some of my initial findings as I was watching this video, but I'd love to know what you think about atheism versus 25 Christians. Let me know what you think, and a link to the Jubilee video will be in the description as well. Thanks for watching, folks, and thanks for listening to me, Rabel. Take care, everyone, and I will definitely catch you in the next one.